Nursery rhymes. Those catchy poems and songs that were read to us as children. The stories that are whimsical and educational and that we feel oddly nostalgic about. But when was the last time you stopped and actually thought about these stories? Because I've been thinking a lot about nursery rhymes lately, and oh boy, some of them are a lot darker than I remember. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Nursery rhymes are supposed to be easy to recall poems that embody valuable lessons that serve children as they grow up. But some of these lessons are a bit difficult to discern. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. She gave them some broth without any bread and whipped them all soundly and put them to bed. This poem was written in 1794, back when people thought mercury, the liquid metal, was a cure for syphilis and depression. And proverbs like this guided parental decision-making. So it's no surprise that physical abuse was normalized enough to make it into nursery rhymes. But we live in a much different world now. We live in a world where child protective services will remove children from dangerous situations. And as a society, our evolved understanding reinforces the notion that physical abuse is wrong. But what we may not so easily recognize is the quiet cousin of physical abuse: neglect. Child neglect is a type of child abuse in which a caregiver fails to provide adequate supervision for a child, considering such factors as child's age, mental ability, physical conditions, length of caregiver's absence, and state of household. It's significant to note that there's two major types of neglect. Physical neglect involves a caregiver ignoring the physical needs of a child. Little Red Riding Hood is a prominent example that we can recognize. Our protagonist is 14 years old, and she's pursued and ultimately consumed by a wolf because of her parents' negligence. A kindly huntsman saves the day by slicing the wolf open, and Little Red Riding Hood springs within from the wolf's digestive tracts, unscathed. In the absence of a fairy tale ending, things would have ended much differently. Red and Grandma would have been ripped to shreds by a wolf and died of blood loss, muscle damage, or shock. Story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears is not much better. Mr. and Mrs. Locks don't appear to be remotely interested in their daughter's misadventures. In the story, Goldie commits breaking and entering, destruction of property, and theft. There's various endings of the story that feature a distinctly grisly end for Goldie, ranging from the bears setting her on fire, to her dying alone in the forest, to her arrest for vagrancy. Although we may not always realize, neglect is often a contributing factor to young adolescent characters' problems and troubles in literature and pop culture. Emotional neglect involves a caregiver ignoring the emotional needs of a child. These can include support, affection, intimacy, or connection. Kevin McAllister from Home Alone is a good example that we can recognize that demonstrate the severe consequences of emotional neglect. Kevin experiences wide ranges of emotions as an 8-year-old who's left home alone when his parents fails to wake him up on the morning of an international trip. As his family becomes increasingly fed up with his antics, they stonewall him and ultimately banish him as a disciplinary measure. When Kevin's mother becomes aware of his absence and is increasingly concerned for his well-being as well as how others will perceive her as a mother, circumstances arise that are ridiculous, as Kevin courageously and cleverly confronts burglars in ways that few 8-year-olds can. I wonder if by depicting fictional characters, fictional children, as overly competent and resilient Such stories are normalizing that it is okay to be inattentive of children. Neglect is a topic that has been on my mind for a long time. There were circumstances in my life that arose that brought these feelings and wonderings to the surface. One instance that I'll share with you serves as a reminder that neglect is a lot more common than we might acknowledge. I was at a mall, and I saw a crying boy who couldn't have been older than 10. His father grabbed him by the collars and dragged him outside the mall. His tone was threatening as he shouted, "You think crying's gonna do anything? The real world won't coddle you. Why don't you just grow up?" Like Kevin's parents, the boy's father stonewalled him and banished him, and told him to come back inside once he stopped behaving like a little girl. This was distressing to many of us within the earshot on so many different levels. Several minutes passed with the boy standing outside in the cold, vacant parking lots, sniffling as he tried to toughen up and match his father's unreasonable expectations. It's difficult to know what provoked the father's brutish reaction, but I'm not sure if it matters. As the initial vehemence of the situation abated, people went about their business, slicing here and there for attention. I was less able to ignore the event. The boy reminded me of myself when I was at his age. I also had parents who stonewalled me and banished me if I expressed feelings or thoughts that contradicted their perspective or experiences. I grew up hearing, "What makes you think you deserve to be mad?" I experienced long periods of emotional distress in which, when I searched for comfort, my parents would either push me away or leave me to manage my own stress alone. My mom used to say, "You know, there's people with actual problems out there, not you." It was depressing to be diminished to a state where I felt like my mom didn't care about me or what I thought or how I felt. And my father, well, he lacked the tools to bridge the widening gaps between my mom and me, but he did try, and I felt like I mattered to him. Fast forward through several years of patterned responses, I began to understand the depth of loneliness, lack of self-worth, manic depressive episodes, and therapy that I would need to escape what I came to realize were the severe consequences of emotional neglect. It's only been very recently that my parents have started responding more empathetically to own their parental responsibilities for emotional support. Even though my parents are trying, I still sometimes feel like I don't matter, that I'm unimportant. Emotional neglect has severe consequences. It's been known to cause hyperactivity, aggression, developmental delays, low self-esteem, substance abuse, and host of other emotional disorders in children. If untreated, it could develop into psychiatric disorders in adults. In 2019, there was a research conducted on the prevalence rate of emotional neglect in psychiatric outpatients. It studied 354 participants aged 14 to 35. What they found out was that across a variety of mental illnesses, emotional neglect was prevalent among 40% of the participants, implying that there was a positive correlation between emotional neglect and development of mental illnesses. And according to University of Manchester in South Wales, those who are emotionally neglected as children are 2.5 times more likely to commit suicide than those who are not. You might be wondering, what's causing this and how can we prevent it? There's many different levels and styles to parenting. Some parents believe that ensuring food, shelter, and safety is enough to meet their child's needs. Such parents will leave food in the fridge or give their children allowances to buy their own food, expecting them to stay safe and out of trouble. But for me and for many of my peers, I can confidently say that that is not enough. As people, especially adolescents and children, need connection and intimacy to thrive, and no one has demonstrated this better than Maslow. His renowned theory depicts personal development based on the pursuit of different levels of needs. If we are to deconstruct the human, at the base we'll find ourselves bones, muscles, tissues, and organs. They cannot function without physiological needs like water and food, and I'm sure most of us in the audience can agree that these are human necessities. And in Korea, acquiring these needs are rarely an issue. As we move on to more complex systems like the brain, we realize that emotional and psychological needs are integral to the development of complex emotions. And these needs are just as important as physiological ones because they eventually develop self-esteem, social skills, and healthy emotional outlook. Dr. Harry Harlow's wire mother experiments substantiate Maslow's theory. The objective of this experiment was to assess the affectional response in neonatal and infant monkeys. Harlow would place monkeys in spacious cages that were split into two areas, each with its own surrogate mother. One monkey was made up of wires and lactated, while the other was made up of cloth and sponge. All monkeys took nourishment from the wire mother, but surprisingly, as time passed, the monkeys began to spend less and less time with the wire mother and significantly more time with the cloth mother. When Harlow added a stressor to the environment, they realized that the monkeys instinctively sought out the cloth mother, despite it providing no less or more protection than the wire mother. At one point of their development, the babies began to spend less than an hour per day with the wire mother and more than 18 hours per day with the cloth mother. When Harlow repeated this experiment with feeding, the results of this study showed that with basic physiological needs met, the monkeys will pursue connection and comfort, just like how Maslow predicted. This was 75 years ago, but even in 2023, developmental psychologists reference Harlow's study, which not only proves that it's relevant to modern day, but also it's transferable to humans. Healthy emotional attachment is formed through prolonged emotional comfort and is sustained through quality time. Korean teens spend about 12 to 16 hours per day at schools or at special academies called hagwons. Compare that to the national average of 1.5 hours they spend with their parents on the weekdays and 5.1 hours they spend on the weekends. And now, with a lot of societal pressure and overemphasis on education, many Korean parents will spend that time scolding their children about academics or chores, or would be too exhausted from their work to facilitate loving, supportive conversations. When parents are emotionally detached, children cannot form a healthy attachment. Now we move back to the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization. Those who are able to climb to the highest ranks of need can fully embrace their full potentials. Such individuals can more easily strive for greatness, success professionally and personally, and self-enrichment. Many successful parents recognize this, so they try to bring their children to self-actualization. But many parents who don't recognize this and stop at the base of the pyramid, providing the bare minimum, and expect their children to grow up to be self-actualizers like Albert Einstein and Jane Addams, have totally unrealistic standards that put undue strain on children who are ill-equipped to climb up the Maslow's hierarchy. This was my experience. And while it infuriates me, I recognize that the blame doesn't solely fall on my parents' shoulder. In December, when I brought to my mother's attention that I was going to give a TED Talk about emotional neglect, her first response was to tell me, most parents actually do love their children, but it's the lack of experience and education necessary to understand what being truly there for their children means. And I know she was speaking from her own experience because I've seen this to be true for my mother. My mom grew up in a very unstable household, and My grandmother was too busy, so she seldom had time to check even if my mother had eaten dinner. This led me to explore this problem as a whole intergenerational cycle. My mom belongs to the 70s. She's part of the Generation X. And her parents were born in the 40s, which makes them a part of the silent generation. My grandparents were children when World War II subjected them to Japanese imperialism and occupation. They experienced unimaginable cruelties, they starved for weeks, and they lived in fear of being arrested, tortured, and killed. To my great-grandparents, securing food and safety would have been a daily challenge, so much so that acquiring emotional needs for my grandparents wouldn't have even reached their radar. My grandparents' unresolved trauma had led them to raise my parents without being attentive of their emotional needs. Emotionally detached parents will raise children who, without extensive therapy, will also become emotionally detached parents. Thanks to Harlow, Maslow, and many other brilliant scientists out there, we have a better understanding of human developmental needs. We can search for and find all sorts of information that can help us make different decisions for our own lives and progeny. It is time that more of us take this as an opportunity to educate ourselves. We have to do better to break destructive cycles and heal our inner traumas while helping the next generation grow up with greater chances of realizing their limitless potentials. It is time for us to stop being basic. A best thing a parent can do to support their child is to consistently show them emotional support. Communicate with openness, acceptance, empathy, and vulnerability. Tell your children that you love them, often. It'll be weird at first if you're not used to saying this, but that's what practice is for. The earliest memory I have of my mother telling me that she loved me, I thought she was dying of terminal cancer. It was jarring, but I also felt empowered by a sense of worthiness that arguably the most important person in my life was not only validating my existence, but also my significance. If you don't think that it's necessary to tell your children that you love them, because it seems like, wow, such an obvious truth, you're sorely mistaken. Truth that remains unsaid loses its value. And vulnerability in relationship gives us a currency to bail us out of conflict. 사랑해. It's only 3 syllables, but you'd be surprised by how much this word can do to boost self-esteem and encourage your children to be and do better. Parents need to be a positive presence for their kids. When your child comes home from school and has earned a low grade, think twice about putting them down or chastising them. We already feel a lot of social pressure, and we often punish ourselves for getting low scores. So what does you making us feel worse truly change? If we don't feel emotionally safe, we might distance ourselves and lie about the things that we think will disappoint you or you'll shame us for. In order to self-actualize, we need your unconditional love and support. We need to know that it's okay to make mistakes, and we need you to proactively guide us to do better. This is how we build self-esteem. Through validation despite disappointment. Just like how we have to accept that parents are doing whatever they can to support us, parents also have to accept that their children are doing their best to make you proud. Lastly, parents, please spend quality time with your children. I know this is difficult because of your work, but you have to invest in the relationship. Consciously plan activities that are enjoyable for all of you, something that requires a lot of communication and builds creativity and trust, something that helps you bond with your children. Personally, I like outdoor activities, so I go to swim in the ocean or sometimes walk Ola trails, and I take my dad with me. During these excursions, we talk a lot in the car and we laugh. We also feel a sense of shared accomplishment, which helps us bond and make happy memories. With my mom, mom, it's a little bit different. We do seemingly mundane but still very pleasant activities together, like cooking, going on a drive, watching movies. But I find them to be just as valuable as the time I spend with my dad. Spending quality time with my parents has helped us heal our relationship and made me feel comfortable and loved. Parents aren't the only ones who have to act. Children also have responsibility to reach out. I noticed that many of you guys are here alone or with your friends. If your parents are not here to hear this themselves, then you have to start the conversation. Find the courage to communicate what you need from your parents with openness, respect, and sincerity. I know it's scary, but you have to try. You have to meet them halfway. Trust that your parents love you. But you also have to be aware that there are circumstances in which your parents can't support you. So if you live in different countries as your parents, then spending quality time would be almost impossible. Or if your parents are extremely stubborn people and are unwilling to change, then a lot of the solutions that I've suggested will require many reinforcement and patience to work. You may even need to bring in a counselor or a therapist. Or in the most difficult cases, accept that you cannot move people who do not wish to be moved. But there are solutions. You can diversify your exposures to healthy examples. So if your parents can't support you, perhaps a therapist can teach you ways to manage and heal your traumas. But a therapist will treat you as patients, and you won't likely get all your emotional needs met by them. So you'll have to surround yourself with people who inspire, support, and is kind to you. Last November, I was in a very difficult position, and my parents were unable to guide me through this very tumultuous period because of travel and work. So I reached out to a teacher. Fortunately, this teacher was more than helpful to me. She guided me through this process of asking for assistance, and she taught me how to open up. She connected me with my counselors and other mental health resources. She remains committed to providing me support and advice. If it hadn't been for her support and care, I probably wouldn't be here giving this talk. Trust that even in the most tumultuous period, there are people who are willing to stand by you. Consider God, your best self, or the universe throwing you a buoy in form of another human being when you're just one wave away from drowning. Pull your head up above the water to realize that there is a teacher, counselor, mentor, sports coach, or relative who will answer your cries of help if you let them. Find people who inspires you to be kind and compassionate to yourselves and others. It can be anyone as long as their socio-emotional skills and mental hygiene exceeds your own. Whereas they may not entirely replace your parents, they can meet some of your emotional needs. And they might give you a blueprint to healthy relationship and self-love, which will take you closer to self-actualization. Mentoring a child is not something that's easy. It requires enormous amount of dedication, love, and patience that not everyone is willing to offer or has the ability to offer. But I'd like to encourage all the adults in the audience and those who are tuning in at home to notice if a child is trying to meet their developmental needs. Have the decency to show them some kindness, empathy, and if you can't directly help them, point them in the direction of someone who can. Let's also try to be a little bit more supportive of each other. There's a Korean saying, 칭찬은 고래도 춤추게 한다, which can be roughly translated into, praises can even make whales dance. Warmth and positivity will do wonders for people who've been deprived of it, and it could be a gateway to personal development. By working together, we can destroy the cycle of intergenerational trauma and neglect and create a world in which we have children who are loved and supported, and they raise children who are loved and supported, so that as a species, we can all inspire each other to reach our limitless potentials. In such a world, we wouldn't have grim, dark tales of trauma, emotional neglect, or abuse. Instead, we'll have something that sounds like this. Thank you.